Hello everyone, and welcome back to It's Funny to Tears. Today we're taking a trip down memory lane back to the one place where chaos, confusion, and comedy were part of the daily curriculum, the classroom. We've all been there, right? Staring at the clock, waiting for the bell. When suddenly, something so unexpected happens that the entire class just loses it. Get ready. Because we've gathered some of the most hilarious and unforgettable classroom moments that will have you laughing so hard you might just shed a tear. Let's kick things off with a classic, the substitute teacher. You know the drill. The regular teacher is out, and in walks a sub who has no idea what they've just stepped into. I remember one time, we had a substitute for our history class. This guy, bless his heart, was trying his best to take attendance, but he was struggling with the names. He gets to my friend, Michael, but reads his last name first. So he calls out, "Williams, Michael?" Michael, being the class clown, stands up, puts his hand on his heart, and in a booming voice, sings the first line of a famous Michael Jackson song. The entire class erupted. The sub just stood there, blinked a few times, and then slowly, a smile spread across his face. He just shook his head and said, "All right, Michael, you're present." For the rest of the day, any time he needed Michael's attention, he'd just hum the tune. Then there are those moments of pure, unfiltered honesty from kids. Little kids have no filter, and it's the best thing ever. A friend of mine who's a first-grade teacher told me this story. She was teaching her students about different jobs, and she asked them, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" She got the usual answers. Astronaut, firefighter, doctor. But then, one little girl raised her hand, very serious, and said, "I want to be a professional napper." My friend tried to hold back her laughter and asked, "A professional napper? Why is that?" The little girl replied with perfect logic, "Because my dad says he's a professional napper on the weekends, and he looks very happy." You just can't argue with that logic, can you? I think we could all use a bit of that in our lives. Let's talk about science class. Science class is a goldmine for funny moments, especially during experiments. Things bubble, they fizz, and sometimes they go a little bit wrong. I'll never forget our 8th grade chemistry class. We were supposed to be doing a simple experiment involving vinegar and baking soda to demonstrate a chemical reaction. Our teacher, Mr. Harris, was very strict about following instructions. But one group, let's just call them the creative chemists, decided to improve the experiment. They thought, more is better, right? So they tripled the amount of baking soda and vinegar. The result? A volcanic eruption of foam that shot out of the beaker, all over their table, and onto the floor. Mr. Harris just walked over, looked at the bubbly mess, looked at the 3 of them covered in foam, and said, with a completely straight face, "Well, I see you've discovered the 'don't do that' principle of chemistry." The entire class was in stitches for the next 10 minutes. And who could forget the absolute terror and comedy of presentations? Standing in front of the whole class, your palms are sweaty, your knees are weak. You know the feeling. I remember in high school we had to do a presentation on a famous historical figure. My friend decided to do his on Julius Caesar. He went all out. He even wrapped himself in a white bedsheet to look like a toga. He's in the middle of his big, dramatic speech about crossing the Rubicon when the bedsheet, which was not very secure, starts to slip. He's trying to hold it up with one hand while gesticulating wildly with the other. The sheet keeps slipping lower and lower. The class is trying so hard not to laugh, but you could see everyone's shoulders shaking. Finally, right at his most dramatic point, the sheet gives up and falls down around his ankles, revealing his jeans and a superhero t-shirt underneath. The room exploded with laughter. He just stood there, looked down, looked up, and said, et tu, brute? Et tu, sheet?" He got an A for creativity and for being a good sport. Sometimes the funniest moments come from pure misunderstanding. In my literature class in college, we were discussing a very complex poem. The professor asked a student what he thought a particular line meant. This guy, who clearly hadn't done the reading, started to panic. He rambled for a solid minute, using big, impressive words that had absolutely nothing to do with the poem. He was weaving this incredible web of nonsense. The professor let him finish, and then, after a long pause, she just said, That was, without a doubt, the most creative and completely incorrect interpretation I have ever heard in my 30 years of teaching. The student just sank into his chair, bright red, while the rest of us tried to stifle our giggles. You have to admire the confidence, though. When in doubt, just make it sound smart. Let's not forget the teachers themselves. The best teachers were the ones who had a great sense of humor. My math teacher, Mrs. Davison, was a legend. She knew math was tough for a lot of us. One day she was explaining a really difficult concept, and she could see from our blank faces that nobody was getting it. She stopped, sighed, and said, "Okay, I see that my explanation was as clear as mud. Let's try this again. But first, a story." She then told us a hilarious story about how she once tried to use the same math concept to bake a cake and ended up with something that could have been used as a doorstop. It had nothing to do with the lesson, but it made us all relax and laugh. When she went back to explaining the problem, suddenly it seemed a lot less intimidating. Her ability to laugh at herself made her an incredible teacher. Another classic is the sleepy student. We've all been that person, fighting to keep our eyes open after a late night. I once sat next to a guy in a morning lecture who fell asleep and started snoring. Not just a little snore, but a full-on, rumbling snore. The professor stopped talking. Everyone turned to look. The guy next to him gently nudged him, and he jolted awake, shouting, "I object." The whole lecture hall just lost it. He thought he was in a dream where he was a lawyer. The professor just smiled and said, "Objection overruled. Please try to stay with us in this reality." He was so embarrassed, but it became a running joke for the rest of the semester. And finally, let's end on a moment of sweet accidental genius. A kindergarten teacher was teaching her class about the 5 senses. She asked them, "What can you do with your eyes?" "We can see," they all shouted. "Good. What can you do with your ears?" "We can hear." "Excellent. And what about your nose?" A little boy in the front row, without missing a beat, yelled out, "You can pick it." The teacher just froze, not knowing whether to laugh or to correct him. She eventually managed to say, "Well, yes, you can do that, but we also use it to smell things like flowers and cookies." That's the beauty of the classroom. It's a place of learning, not just from books, but from each other, from our mistakes, and from those brilliantly funny, unexpected moments that we'll remember long after we've forgotten the quadratic formula. What are some of your funniest classroom memories? I would absolutely love to hear them. Share your stories down in the comments below, because I'm sure you've got some gems. It's amazing how these little moments stick with us and still make us smile years later. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today on It's Funny to Tears. If you enjoyed this trip back to school, make sure to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. Until next time, keep laughing.